Naylara's fingers trembled as she reached for Jack's outstretched hand. His skin felt rough against her smooth palms, textured with calluses and tiny scars that told stories of survival her people would never understand. As their hands connected, a bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating his face in stark relief. His eyes, she noticed, held neither fear nor uncertainty, only focused determination. "We need to move now," Jack shouted over the howling wind. "Stay close and step exactly where I step." The storm intensified around them, turning the familiar landscape Naylara had been cataloging into an alien battleground. Massive purple leaves tore from their stems, becoming dangerous projectiles in the gale. The ground beneath them, previously solid, now shifted with each step as water saturated the soil. Jack moved with surprising grace, each placement of his foot deliberate yet somehow natural. He navigated the chaos not by fighting against it, but by reading its patterns, anticipating the momentary lulls between gusts, finding stable footholds where Naylara's sensors detected only instability. "How are you doing this?" she gasped as he pulled her through a particularly treacherous section, where fallen vegetation created a natural bridge across a rapidly forming ravine. "Experience," he replied simply, though his eyes never stopped scanning their surroundings. "Your body learns to feel the rhythm of a planet if you listen long enough." A massive tree groaned nearby, its root system slowly giving way to the saturated soil. Jack's head snapped toward the sound instantly, his body already moving before Naylara's danger sensors began their warning chirp. He pulled her sharply to the left as the enormous trunk crashed down precisely where they had stood moments before. "That was not statistical probability," Naylara stammered, her scientific mind struggling to process his seemingly precognitive response. "How did you calculate the fall trajectory without instruments?" Jack offered a brief smile as he continued guiding her forward. "Didn't calculate. The sound it made, the way the roots were exposed on the windward side. You feel it more than think it." The concept of knowledge without explicit calculation was foreign to Naylara's education. Zeltaran learning focused on precise formulas and exhaustive databases. This human operated on principles her species had long ago dismissed as primitive: intuition, pattern recognition, bodily knowledge. After 20 minutes of harrowing travel, the silhouette of Jack's dwelling emerged through the sheets of rain, a structure that somehow seemed to grow from the landscape rather than impose upon it. Nestled against a cliff face and partially buried into the hillside, it featured elements clearly salvaged from crashed technology, alongside native materials woven with expert precision. "Welcome to my humble home," Jack said as he ushered her through a doorway reinforced with salvaged metal and sealed with native resins. "It's not exactly a Zeltaran comfort pod, but it hasn't failed me yet." The interior stunned Naylara into momentary silence. Where she expected primitive chaos, she found elegant functionality. Water collection systems channeled the downpour through a series of filters before collecting in storage vessels. Thermal regulation utilized the planet's natural geothermal properties. Most surprising were the walls, covered in detailed hand-drawn maps, catalogs of local species, and weather pattern charts that rivaled Zeltaran meteorological systems in their detail. "You've been studying the planet," she observed, running her fingers along a particularly detailed rendering of the valley's seasonal cycles. "Trying to understand my new home," Jack corrected, efficiently moving around the space as he activated heating elements and secured the entrance against the intensifying storm. "On Earth, we have a saying: knowledge is survival." Naylara watched as he moved with practiced efficiency, each action flowing naturally into the next. There was something beautiful in his movements, something her species, with all their technological advancement, had perhaps lost along their evolutionary journey. "The storm will peak in about 3 hours, Jack explained, pointing to his weather charts. "We should be safe here, but it's going to get loud." As if punctuating his prediction, thunder cracked directly overhead, the sound reverberating through Naylara's sensitive hearing apparatus. She flinched involuntarily, embarrassed by the display of instinctual fear. Jack noticed but offered no judgment. Instead, he handed her a container of clear liquid. Water. Filtered and safe. Your systems are probably stress-taxed right now. The simple act of compassion, addressing her needs without comment on her fear, prompted Nylara's first genuine question. Why did you help me? My presence reduces your survival probability by approximately 23.7%. Jack paused his preparations, regarding her with genuine curiosity. Is that how Zelterans view everything? Survival probabilities. It is the rational approach, she responded, reciting the foundation of her culture's belief system. His answer would begin reshaping everything she understood about humanity. The rational approach, Jack repeated, stirring the fragrant stew with a utensil carved from dense wood. Maybe on your world. Here, rationality needs to be flexible. The concept struck Nylara as contradictory. In Zelteran education, rationality was absolute, a perfect system of logical assessment that produced optimal outcomes when followed precisely. The idea that rationality could bend without breaking represented a paradigm shift. Our histories suggest humans achieved spaceflight through rigid mathematical precision. She countered, accepting the bowl he offered. The stew's complex aroma triggered unfamiliar responses in her sensory processing, pleasure signals her species typically experienced only during successful research breakthroughs. Jack settled across from her, his own portion steaming between his hands. We achieved spaceflight through mathematical precision, combined with gut instinct, educated guesses, and some spectacular failures. A smile touched his lips. The first rockets exploded more often than they flew. We kept going anyway. Nylara sampled the stew, surprised by flavors that complemented rather than competed. You created this from local ingredients. Our toxicity scans indicated 87% of native flora contains compounds harmful to most carbon-based life. Trial and error, Jack replied, reaching for a shelf containing dozens of small containers filled with dry plants. These are safe. Those will kill you. The difference is sometimes just how you prepare them, breaking down certain molecular chains through fermentation or applying specific heating patterns. She studied the organized collection. You tested these on yourself. The statistical risk was necessary, he finished. Small tests, careful observation. My body became my laboratory. The storm howled outside, but the dwelling remained secure, each reinforcement placed with precise understanding of stress vectors and material properties. Jack moved to adjust a ceiling panel where minor seepage had begun, applying a resin mixture that sealed the leak instantly. Your adaptations display remarkable engineering principles, Nylara observed. Yet you implement them without computational assistance. Jack's laugh surprised her, warm and genuine. 3 engineering degrees before I left Earth. Just because I live primitively doesn't mean I think primitively. This revelation shifted her assessment. Zelterans categorized beings primarily by their technological expressions rather than inherent capabilities. Jack represented something their models failed to anticipate: technological regression by choice rather than limitation. Why maintain these skills when your technology was lost? She asked, genuinely curious. Zelterans would focus resources on rebuilding computational interfaces first. Jack set his empty bowl aside and moved to a workstation where half-completed projects displayed remarkable ingenuity. Solder collectors fashioned from salvaged communication arrays, water purification systems utilizing local mineral deposits. Technology serves life, not the other way around, he explained, retrieving a journal filled with handwritten notes and intricate diagrams. I could have spent years trying to replicate Earth technology from memory, or I could adapt, integrate what I know with what this planet offers. He opened the journal to pages depicting native plants alongside chemical analyses, performed using rudimentary tools. This approach revealed something unexpected. This planet's ecosystem operates on principles we never encountered before, symbiotic relationships so complex they border on communication networks. Nylara leaned forward, her scientific curiosity overriding cultural hesitation. The diagrams depicted mycorrhizal networks connecting plant systems, similar to discoveries on other worlds, but with distinctive variations that suggested higher-order organization. "You've been conducting original research," she realized, recognizing the methodical documentation that rivaled Zeltaran standards despite limited tools. "Knowledge doesn't require approval to be valid," Jack replied, his statement challenging the hierarchical verification systems upon which Zeltaran science was built. Observation, hypothesis, testing, conclusion. The scientific method works with or without committees. As night settled fully and the storm reached its thunderous peak, Jack activated bioluminescent cultures he cultivated from local organisms. The dwelling filled with a soft blue glow that shifted with air currents, practical illumination that doubled as an atmospheric warning system. "The color changes if atmospheric toxins rise above safe levels," he explained, noting her analytical gaze. Simple but effective. Nelara considered everything she'd witnessed since meeting this human. Technology reimagined rather than simply replicated, science practiced without institutional constraints, survival elevated beyond mere existence. Jack represented a model of adaptation her species had theorized but never truly understood. Integration rather than imposition. "Tomorrow, I'll help you retrieve what's salvageable from your shuttle," Jack offered, preparing sleeping arrangements with the same efficient grace that characterized all his movements. "For tonight, we wait out the storm." The question that formed in Nilara's mind would have been considered dangerously radical on her homeworld. What if Zeltaran advancement had reached its limits not through perfection but specialization? What if true evolutionary progress lay not in technological complexity but adaptational flexibility? Outside, the storm continued its assault on the landscape, reshaping everything in its path. Inside, something equally transformative had begun. The forest felt different at night. Bioluminescent fungi cast an ethereal blue glow across the undergrowth, creating pools of light amid the darkness. Jack moved like a shadow between these natural beacons, his steps nearly silent despite the debris-strewn forest floor. Nylara struggled to match his quiet precision, her movements feeling clumsy and conspicuous in comparison. "Lower your center of gravity," Jack whispered, demonstrating a half-crouch that distributed weight more evenly. "Feel the ground before committing your weight. Think of yourself as part of the forest, not separate from it." The concept seemed illogical. She was objectively separate from the ecosystem, an alien presence by definition. Yet as she mimicked his posture and focused on the sensory feedback from each step, Nylara felt a subtle shift in her awareness. The forest changed from an obstacle course of potential missteps to a living network she could navigate by attending to its patterns. "The stalkers can detect heat signatures and movement vibrations," Jack explained as they paused behind a massive fallen trunk. "They hunt primarily through prediction, anticipating where prey will go based on previous movements. Break the pattern, break their advantage." He demonstrated a zigzag progression that appeared random but followed subtle pathways of denser ground. Nylara's analytical mind recognized the mathematical beauty in his movement, adaptive chaos theory applied through physical intuition. "Your shuttle team is approximately 3 kilometers southeast." Jack pointed toward a distant ridge barely visible in the darkness. "The stalkers have established a hunting perimeter around the energy signature. They're intelligent. They recognize technology as a sign of potential prey. Zeltaran research classifies them as non-sentient predators," Nilara countered, recalling her species' xenobiological database. Jack's expression remained neutral, but his response carried unmistakable certainty. "Your research observed them. I've survived them. They learn, adapt, and pass knowledge between generations. That's intelligence by any practical definition." This perspective, that intelligence manifested through adaptation rather than abstract reasoning, challenged Zeltaran taxonomy systems. Her people measured cognitive capacity through problem-solving standardization, not survival efficacy. As they continued their careful progress, Jack pointed out easily missed signs of stalker presence, Distinctive claw marks on trees placed precisely at communication height for their species, broken vegetation arranged in patterns that created invisible territorial boundaries, subtle scent markers that human senses could detect but instruments often missed. They're communicating, Nilera realized, seeing the systematic nature of the markings, creating a coordinated hunting strategy. Jack nodded approval at her observation. Exactly. Which means we need our own strategy. He retrieved small containers from his pack, each filled with pungent paste made from local flora. This disrupts their olfactory senses, overwhelms without alerting them to deliberate interference. He applied the substance to strategic points on their clothing and exposed skin. The smell made Nilera's sensitive olfactory receptors burn slightly, but the discomfort represented an acceptable trade-off for survival advantage. Your team will be following Zeltaran emergency protocols, Jack noted as they approached the final ridge separating them from the shuttle crash site. That predictability makes them vulnerable. The stalkers have likely identified pattern weaknesses in their defensive measures. Nilera accessed her species' standard protocols mentally, suddenly seeing the dangerous regularities within them. Timed perimeter checks, systematic resource allocation, predictable response patterns to external threats. Everything designed for efficiency rather than adaptability. We need to disrupt the stalkers' expectations, she suggested, the concept of strategic unpredictability crystallizing in her mind. Create a scenario they haven't encountered before. Jack's smile conveyed genuine respect. Acknowledgement of her cognitive leap beyond her training. Now you're thinking like a survivor. From their vantage point atop the ridge, they could see the damaged shuttle gleaming under the planet's 3 moons. 6 stalkers prowled the perimeter with unmistakable purpose, testing the craft's structural integrity at regular intervals. Their massive forms, each nearly 3 meters of corded muscle and armored hide, moved with unsettling coordination. They're learning the shuttle's vulnerabilities, Jack whispered. And your friends are trapped in a slowly failing cage. Nilera's night vision captured the methodical testing, each stalker attacking different sections, then communicating findings to the group. The shuttle's emergency shielding sparked with each impact, growing progressively weaker. Standard shields will fail within 90 minutes, she calculated, analyzing the degradation pattern. Jack was already preparing his strange arsenal of primitive yet ingenious tools. Then we have exactly 1 hour to change the rules of engagement. The air changed suddenly, growing dense with an unmistakable musk that raised the fine filaments along Nilera's spine. Jack froze mid-motion, his body language transforming from fluid movement to absolute stillness in an instant. His hand found hers in the darkness, applying gentle pressure in a silent signal to remain motionless. 3 shadows detached from the forest canopy above them, massive forms descending with surprising grace for creatures their size. The stalkers moved with chilling coordination, positioning themselves in a triangular formation that cut off obvious escape routes. Their elongated heads swiveled in perfect synchronization, thermal sensing organs pulsing with bioluminescent activity as they processed the environment. They've adapted their hunting strategy, Jack breathed, his words barely audible even to Nilera's sensitive hearing. The camouflage pace isn't working anymore. They've learned to filter it out. The concept struck Nilera as impossible. Advanced adaptation within such a compressed time frame contradicted evolutionary models. Yet the evidence surrounded them, breathing and hunting with terrifying intelligence. Split trajectory, Jack whispered. When I move, head directly for that hollow trunk. Don't hesitate, don't change course. Before she could process his instructions fully, Jack erupted into explosive motion, not away from the predators, but toward the largest one. The sheer unexpectedness of his charge created momentary confusion in the stalkers' coordinated attack. They had anticipated flight, not confrontation. Nilera forced her body into action, fighting against instinctual paralysis as she sprinted toward the fallen tree Jack had indicated. Her movement triggered immediate response from 2 stalkers that peeled away from their formation to intercept her. Their speed was terrifying. covering ground with elongated strides that rapidly closed the distance. She reached the hollow trunk seconds before the predators, diving into the opening that barely accommodated her slender form. Sharp claws scrabbled at the entrance, unable to fit through the narrow aperture. Nylara pressed deeper into the rotting wood, realizing Jack had identified a refuge specifically sized to exclude the stalker's massive limbs. The sounds of the confrontation reached her through the wood, not the expected noises of combat, but a strange cadence of movement and counter-movement. Shifting her position, she peered through a crack in the trunk's surface. What she witnessed defied categorization within Zoltaran combat understanding. Jack wasn't fighting the stalker in any conventional sense. He was dancing with it, anticipating its movements with uncanny precision. Each time the creature lunged, Jack was no longer there, having shifted position microseconds before the attack initiated. He utilized the environment as extension of himself, rebounding off trees, sliding under low branches that forced the stalker to alter its approach. Most surprising was his expression, intensely focused yet without panic. His eyes tracked minute muscle movements in the predator's form, reading intention before action. When he did strike, his attacks targeted specific neurological junctions with the precision of someone intimately familiar with stalker physiology. He studied them, Nylara realized, watching Jack temporarily disable the creature's primary sensory node with a precisely aimed blow. The momentary advantage allowed Jack to create distance, drawing the disoriented stalker away from Nylara's position. The two remaining predators hesitated, their synchronized hunting pattern disrupted by this unprecedented prey behavior. Taking advantage of their confusion, Jack retrieved a small object from his belt, one of his handcrafted devices. With perfect timing, he activated it and flung it into the space between the stalkers. The device emitted a piercing frequency that targeted the creature's auditory systems, creating disorienting neural feedback. The stalkers recoiled, their coordinated movements deteriorating into individual responses. Jack seized the opportunity, darting toward Nylara's hiding place, with the controlled speed of someone who understood exactly how much noise each footfall would generate. "Move," he commanded, reaching the hollow trunk. Their disorientation will last approximately 20 seconds. As Nylara emerged, she noticed blood streaming from a deep gash across Jack's shoulder where the primary stalker had connected. Despite the severity of the wound, his movements remained precise, his focus unwavering. "You're injured," she stated, medical training automatically assessing the damage. "Survival first, treatment later," Jack responded, already leading them along a new trajectory that exploited the stalker's temporary confusion. "They'll recover quickly and track us by blood scent. We need to reach the river tributary." The calm practicality with which he approached his own injury, neither minimizing nor exaggerating its significance, demonstrated a relationship with physical pain unlike anything in Zoltaran experience. Her people avoided discomfort through preventative measures and immediate medical intervention. Jack integrated pain into his survival calculus as simply another variable to be managed. As they reached the riverbank, Jack immediately waded into the flowing water. "It'll mask our scent trail and clean the wound simultaneously." Efficiency in all things. The practical wisdom in his approach was undeniable. Nylara followed, observing how he utilized the environment's natural properties to serve multiple survival purposes simultaneously. His adaptability wasn't despite his humanity, but because of it, an evolutionary advantage her species had engineered away in favor of technological solutions. The crashed shuttle came into view as they crested the final ridge. Dawn's first light revealed the full extent of the researchers' predicament. The vessel's emergency shielding flickered erratically, energy reserves clearly approaching critical depletion. Two Zoltaran researchers huddled inside, their movements visible through the craft's transparent sections as they methodically rearranged equipment in textbook emergency configurations. "Your colleagues are following standard survival protocols," Jack observed, studying their movements. "Predictable responses to predictable threats." "It's how we're trained," Nylara explained, recognizing the familiar pattern sequence. Categorize threats, implement corresponding countermeasures, conserve resources until extraction. Jack's expression remained neutral, but his response carried unmistakable certainty. That approach works in controlled environments. In truly wild systems, predictability becomes vulnerability. He nodded toward the stalkers circling the shuttle in precise patterns. They're testing every section systematically, learning which areas weaken fastest under pressure. Your friend's shields will fail at the forward sensor array first. The stalkers have already identified the vulnerability. Nylara accessed her communicator, keeping the signal strength minimal to avoid detection. Research Unit 7. Acknowledge transmission. After a brief pause, a response crackled through. Researcher Kelvin. Acknowledging. Nylara, your survival is statistically improbable. Current recommendation is to maintain distance and preserve yourself as secondary research asset. The cold calculation struck Nylara differently than it would have days earlier. What once seemed like logical resource allocation now felt disturbingly detached from the reality of their situation. We're implementing extraction, she replied, ignoring the protocol-mandated response. Prepare for unconventional approach. Negative, came the immediate reply. Statistical models indicate 97.6% failure probability for extraction attempts under current conditions. Procedure mandates conservation of remaining assets. Jack listened to the exchange with remarkable patience. When Nylara lowered her communicator in frustration, he simply nodded in understanding. Your friends are thinking from inside a system designed for different environments, he observed. They can't see alternatives because their training doesn't include them. He retrieved items from his pack, components that seemed random until Nylara recognized the underlying pattern in his selections. Each item could serve multiple functions, create distractions, or disrupt sensory inputs. His preparation wasn't based on a single plan but on creating maximum adaptability. The stalkers hunt based on prediction, Jack explained, assembling a device from shuttle debris and native materials. So we give them something they can't predict. Multiple contradictory signals, unusual stimuli, broken patterns. His fingers worked with practiced precision, connecting components that shouldn't function together yet somehow did. The resulting devices were neither purely technological nor purely primitive. They were adaptive hybrids that utilized principles from both approaches. Researcher Kelvin will resist any plan that doesn't align with Zeltaran protocols, Nylara warned, watching the stalkers' increasingly coordinated testing of the shuttle's shields. Jack continued his preparations without hesitation. Then we need to change the situation until protocol no longer applies. He handed her one of his hybrid devices. This will create electromagnetic pulses that disrupt the stalker's sensory organs. Your colleagues need to be ready to move the moment the shield fails. They won't abandon protocol without statistical justification, Nylara insisted, understanding the rigidity of Zeltaran emergency response training. Jack's smile contained no judgment, only calm certainty. Then we'll need to become the statistical anomaly that forces adaptation. He explained his strategy, not as a fixed sequence of actions, but as a framework of possibilities, each decision point containing multiple branches that could respond to changing conditions. The approach wasn't about predicting every variable, but creating responsive flexibility regardless of what occurred. As Nylara absorbed the plan, she recognized a fundamental difference in problem-solving philosophy. Zeltaran's approached challenges through comprehensive modeling that identified optimal solutions. Jack approached them through creating maximum adaptability to unknown variables, embracing uncertainty rather than trying to eliminate it. Ready? He asked, his devices arranged in precise configuration. The question felt like more than tactical preparation. It represented a choice between systems of thought, between the security of protocol and the freedom of adaptation. Nylara made her decision not through statistical analysis, but through newfound trust in possibility. Ready, she confirmed, positioning herself according to Jack's framework. His expression shifted to focused intensity as he activated the first device. Then let's rewrite the rules of engagement. Jack's shelter transformed into an unexpected cultural intersection over the following days. The rescued Zeltaran researchers, Kelvin and Maurice, initially maintained rigid distance from their human host, their posture and positioning reflecting deep-rooted discomfort with the primitive conditions. They clustered together near the shelter's far wall, communicating in technical jargon that Jack politely pretended not to understand. The dwelling lacks basic sanitization protocols, Kelvin observed, methodically organizing his salvaged equipment in precise geometric patterns. Microbial contamination likely exceeds acceptable parameters. Nylara noticed Jack's subtle smile as he continued preparing a meal from local ingredients. Rather than responding defensively, he simply placed a small sample of his fermented preserves under Kelvin's portable scanner. "Perhaps you'd like to analyze this," Jack suggested calmly. "I think you'll find something interesting in the bacterial profile." Kelvin's reluctant scan revealed complex, symbiotic microorganisms that effectively neutralized environmental pathogens. The discovery visibly unsettled him, evidence of sophisticated bioengineering achieved through intuitive experimentation rather than controlled laboratory conditions. This fermentation process shouldn't function in this planetary ecosystem, Kelvin stated, rechecking his readings with growing confusion. The bacterial balance is too precise to occur naturally. Not naturally, Jack corrected, stirring the cooking pot. Intentionally. 3 years of careful selection and cultivation. The environment provides solutions if you work with it rather than against it. Maurice, the junior researcher whose specialty was scaenobiology, couldn't contain her scientific curiosity, despite cultural hesitations. She edged closer to examine Jack's extensive collection of botanical samples and hand-drawn taxonomic classifications. "Your categorization system doesn't follow standard parameters," she observed, studying his detailed illustrations of native flora. "Yet it contains functional interconnections our preliminary surveys missed entirely." Jack nodded, recognizing her genuine interest beneath the critique. "Your surveys looked for specific markers based on known biological systems. I had to let this planet teach me its own categories." The concept of letting an environment dictate research parameters rather than imposing established frameworks represented a methodological heresy to Zeltaran science. Yet the results displayed around them, sustainable food sources, effective medicines, protective compounds, were undeniable. As the evening progressed, the cultural exchange deepened through necessity. Jack's matter-of-fact approach to their situation, neither minimizing difficulties nor catastrophizing them, gradually relaxed the formal boundaries the Zeltarans maintained. When the night temperature dropped unexpectedly, they had no choice but to accept the insulating blankets he offered, each one crafted from processed fibers that regulated heat with remarkable efficiency. "These retain thermal energy more effectively than our emergency equipment," Maurice admitted, analyzing the weave pattern with growing respect. "The fiber arrangement creates micro-pockets that maximize insulation while minimizing weight. Principles I learned from native burrowing creatures," Jack explained, retrieving his journal to show detailed observations of the planet's small mammals. "They construct nests using similar techniques to survive seasonal temperature fluctuations." Kelvin's expression revealed the internal conflict of a mind encountering evidence that contradicted foundational beliefs. "Your approach lacks methodological consistency. You observe, experiment and implement without proper peer validation or statistical modeling." Jack considered this assessment without defensiveness. Different environments demand different methodologies. Your approach excels in controlled systems where variables can be isolated. Mine developed in response to complex systems where total variable isolation is impossible. The exchange highlighted a fundamental philosophical divide. Zeltaran advancement had flourished through specialized expertise and technological refinement, progressive improvements to established systems. Human advancement had emerged through adaptive flexibility, radical reimagining of possibilities when established systems failed. As night settled fully, the shelter's bioluminescent lighting adjusted automatically to optimal restful wavelengths. The subtle environmental attunement wasn't controlled through programming, but through Jack's careful cultivation of responsive organisms, technology achieved through biological partnership rather than mechanical control. Nylara observed the shelter's elegant functionality with new appreciation. What had initially appeared primitive now revealed itself as sophisticated in an entirely different direction than Zeltaran development had pursued. Jack's dwelling wasn't an inferior attempt at replicating technological solutions, but an alternative path that integrated with natural systems rather than imposing upon them. "Your species abandoned certain developmental pathways prematurely," she suggested as the others settled into sleep. "You explored possibilities we never considered." Jack looked up from his journal, where he was documenting the day's events with the same careful detail he applied to all his observations. Not abandoned, specialized differently. Humans maintain certain adaptive flexibility precisely because our technology frequently failed us. Necessity drove creativity. The morning brought unexpected clarity to their communication systems, a brief atmospheric window that allowed connection with the Zeltaran science vessel in orbit. The transmission quality remained poor, fragmenting data packets and creating translation delays, but the content came through with unmistakable urgency. Massive meteorological disturbance detected, the orbital team reported, their formal tone barely concealing alarm. Preliminary models indicate planetary-scale impact exceeding standard safety parameters. Extraction shuttle launch window closing in 38 hours. Kelvin immediately initiated standard evacuation protocols, organizing their limited equipment with practiced efficiency. "We must proceed to designated extraction coordinates immediately. Current models indicate 87.4% successful extraction probability if we depart within 2 hours." Jack listened to the transmission without visible reaction, but Nylara noticed subtle changes in his posture, a slight tension that hadn't been present before. He moved to his weather mapping station, consulting elaborate charts and natural indicator systems with methodical focus. "Your extraction coordinates won't work," he finally stated, his tone matter-of-fact rather than confrontational. "The coming storm isn't following standard meteorological patterns. It's a cyclical mega-event that occurs approximately every 50 planetary cycles." Kelvin dismissed this assessment with practiced authority. "Our atmospheric modeling systems incorporate comprehensive variable analysis. The coordinates have been calculated to minimize risk factors." Rather than argue, Jack retrieved a battered storage container from a concealed compartment beneath the shelter floor. Inside lay organized documentation that stunned the researchers into momentary silence. Handwritten atmospheric pressure records spanning 3 years, precisely measured precipitation samples preserved in crystalline vials, and systematic observations of biological responses to atmospheric changes. "The planet itself has been preparing for this event," Jack explained, indicating subtle changes in native flora consistent with atmospheric pressure fluctuations. Root systems contracting, seed casings hardening, migratory species moving to higher elevations. "I've been tracking these indicators since my second season here." He unfolded a hand-drawn map revealing terrain features invisible to standard scanning systems, underground waterways, geothermal vents, and cave networks extending deep beneath the planetary surface. "Your extraction coordinates are directly in the path of what will become a massive flash flood basin," he continued, tracing natural drainage patterns that orbital scans had missed. "When the atmospheric pressure drops below critical threshold, these underground reservoirs will release catastrophically." The evidence presented challenged not just their extraction plan but fundamental Zeltaran confidence in technological assessment over environmental integration. Maurice examined Jack's documentation with growing concern, her scientific training recognizing the methodical rigor behind his unconventional presentation. "His observational methodology is sound," she reluctantly confirmed to Kelvin. "The correlation between biological indicators and atmospheric measurements shows statistical significance." Jack continued his preparations without waiting for their acceptance, retrieving stored supplies from multiple caches he had established throughout the surrounding area. His readiness wasn't a recent response, but the culmination of years of careful preparation. watching, learning, and adapting to the planet's rhythms. "I've been preparing a secure location," he explained, indicating the cave network on his map. "Deep enough to avoid atmospheric turbulence, naturally insulated against temperature extremes, with sustainable water sources and air circulation." Kelvin struggled visibly with this challenge to establish procedure. "The extraction coordinates are confirmed protocol. Deviation represents unacceptable risk to mission parameters. Your protocols were designed without knowledge of this specific planetary cycle," Jack responded, his tone remaining respectful despite the urgency. "Sometimes survival requires adapting the map when it doesn't match the territory." The philosophical divide crystallized in this moment of crisis. Zeltaran adherence to system-level protocols versus human adaptation to immediate conditions. What appeared as recklessness to the researchers represented to Jack the essence of practical wisdom, recognizing when established knowledge reached its limits and direct experience needed to take precedence. Nylara found herself at the intersection of these worldviews, recognizing validity in both approaches while understanding the unique demands of their current situation. The decision before them wasn't simply about logistics, but about fundamental trust in different forms of knowledge. "The storm is coming regardless of our preferences," Jack observed, continuing his preparations with calm efficiency. "The only relevant question is how we choose to meet it." The megastorm unleashed its full fury as they reached the final chamber of Jack's underground sanctuary. Wind howled through the outer passages with enough force to vibrate the stone itself, creating an otherworldly resonance that penetrated even the deepest recesses of their shelter. The four of them, human, Nylara, and the two Zeltaran researchers, huddled in the relative safety of the central chamber as the planet above them transformed into an uninhabitable maelstrom. Atmospheric pressure continuing to drop. Kelvin reported, monitoring his remaining functional instruments with growing concern. Current conditions exceed catastrophic classification by 43%. No recorded data exists for storms of this magnitude. Jack nodded calmly, making minor adjustments to their shelter's support structures. Each modification addressed subtle changes in the cave's resonance pattern, strengthening areas experiencing increased stress while relieving pressure points before they became critical. "The indigenous populations have records," he observed, indicating ancient markings on the cave walls that the others had dismissed as random scratches. "These patterns document previous storm cycles, approximately 50 standard years between events based on growth ring analysis of surface flora." Marais studied the markings with newfound respect, recognizing the systematic nature of what had initially appeared primitive. "These aren't decorative. They're data preservation mechanisms." "Exactly," Jack confirmed. "Knowledge doesn't require digital storage to maintain continuity. Some information methods survive precisely because they don't depend on technology that can fail." A violent tremor shook the chamber as pressure differentials above created localized vacuum pockets. A support column began to fracture along a previously invisible fault line, threatening the integrity of their sanctuary. The Zeltarans froze in momentary analysis paralysis, their minds calculating countless failure possibilities without producing immediate action. Jack moved instantly toward the critical point, his body responding before conscious calculation finished. "Nylara, the resin mixture from your medical kit, it can bond with the mineral composition of this rock formation." Without hesitation, Nylara retrieved the compound, instinctively understanding his intention. Together, they applied the substance in precise layers that distributed pressure across the fracture zone rather than concentrating it at failure points. The modification didn't eliminate the stress, but redirected it through pathways that could sustain greater load. "Innovative application of medical adhesive beyond design parameters," Kelvin observed, his tone revealing reluctant admiration. "Function often extends beyond intended purpose when necessity demands it," Jack responded, already moving to address the next potential failure point with the same calm efficiency. As the storm reached its catastrophic peak, their shelter held against forces that should have destroyed it. Jack's preparations had anticipated not just the storm's existence, but its specific impact patterns on underground formations. His understanding wasn't theoretical but experiential, knowledge gained through years of listening to the planet's subtle communications. During a momentary lull as pressure systems temporarily stabilized, Nylara found herself beside Jack in a quiet corner of the chamber. The others had finally surrendered to exhaustion after hours of constant vigilance. "Why did you choose to help me that first day?" she asked, the question that had lingered since their initial encounter. "Your survival probability would have been significantly higher alone." Jack considered her question with genuine reflection. Humans discovered something important during our evolution. Sometimes the mathematical probabilities miss critical variables. He glanced toward the sleeping researchers. "Your species approaches survival through individual optimization. Mine found that cooperation often creates possibilities that isolation eliminates." His hand traced one of the ancient markings on the wall, a simple spiral that Nylara now recognized as a storm pattern documentation. "The truly interesting thing is that this cooperative instinct extends beyond our own kind. We recognize intelligence in all its forms and value it instinctively." The concept challenged fundamental Zeltaran understanding of evolutionary advantage. Their civilization had developed through specialization and efficiency optimization, each individual fulfilling precisely defined functions within the larger system. Human development had apparently followed a different path, maintaining cooperative flexibility across specialized boundaries. "Your species' approach isn't irrational," Jack continued softly. "It's differently rational, optimized for stability in controlled environments. Mine developed in response to unpredictable conditions, where rigid specialization becomes vulnerability." As the storm continued its assault on the world above, Nylara recognized that their underground sanctuary represented more than physical protection. It embodied a philosophical refuge where different evolutionary approaches could find common ground, where the structured precision of Zeltaran thought could learn from the adaptive flexibility of human intuition. "The storm will pass," Jack assured her, his certainty based not on calculation, but on the cyclical patterns he had observed in this world. "And when it does, both our approaches will be needed for what comes next."